Morning comes to the old Jewish cemetery almost unnoticed. Light settles on the grass, on the leaning matzevot, on letters that can still be read if you step closer. There are no grand monuments here. Only stone, moss, traces of rain, and the names of people whom no one has called home for a very long time. Birds call to one another above the fence. The wind stirs the dry stalks. 2 seconds. And then the silence is broken by an engine. At first, it is far away. Then it comes closer. The tracks crush the earth. The bucket rises. And the place where parents, children, teachers, doctors, craftsmen, and rabbis had rested for decades suddenly becomes a plot of land. The site of a future park, a road, a stadium, a source of construction material. Sometimes memory is destroyed not by fire or gunfire. Sometimes it is simply demolished, like an old place that supposedly no longer matters to anyone. But what exactly disappears when a cemetery disappears? Only stones? Only a religious ritual? Or the final book of a people whose pages were written not in ink, but carved into stone? Before this story begins to reveal its layers, support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel. Subjects like this rarely receive widespread attention, which is precisely why they need an attentive audience. The first layer of this memory is stone. The Jewish gravestone is called a matzeva. To someone who cannot understand the language of the inscription, it may appear to be nothing more than an old slab. But many matzevot contain far more than a surname and a date. They may preserve the deceased person's Hebrew name, the name of their father, sometimes their age, details of their life, words of respect, the phrase, "here lies," and the traditional wish that their soul be bound in the bond of eternal life. For a researcher, a single stone can restore another generation of a family, because the father's name is often included directly in the epitaph. A stone might bear the image of hands, a pitcher, a candlestick, a broken branch, or a tree. These symbols could indicate ancestry, religious service, a family role, or an early death. Not every symbol can be interpreted with certainty, but together they transform the cemetery into a language. The stone did not merely say, "This person died." It said, "This person belonged to a family, a community, and a tradition. Their life had a place and a name." That is why destroying a matzeva is not simply the destruction of an object. It is the severing of a connection between generations. Imagine a family photograph with the names of everyone pictured written on the back. Now imagine those names being scraped away. The people remain in the photograph, but the connection between them disappears. A Jewish cemetery performed a similar function. It preserved family relationships in places where archives burned, borders shifted, surnames were recorded in different ways, and families were scattered across empires and countries. The second layer is family. The people buried in the cemetery were not an abstract religious group. There lay a father, whom his son remembered as a young man, a mother whose recipes were still repeated in the kitchen, a child who had lived far too briefly, a teacher whom people visited for advice, a doctor who treated patients in a small provincial town, an elderly tailor, a cantor, a bookseller, a woman whose name may never have appeared in any government directory, but remained on a stone. When such a stone disappeared, the family did not lose property. It lost the address of its memory. The most painful cruelty here was a quiet one. The authorities did not have to forbid someone from remembering their mother. They simply changed the designated use of the land, removed the fence, carried away the stones, and laid down a path. A few years later, a relative would return to a place where they had once known every turn, and find no spot where they could even stop. First the fence disappears, then the path, then the name. The third layer is the community. Before revolutions, wars, and mass murder, the Jewish cemetery in many cities and towns of Eastern Europe formed part of a complex and vibrant world. Nearby stood synagogues, schools, charitable societies, craftsmen's associations, libraries, hospitals, and markets. After the Holocaust, many communities were almost completely destroyed. Survivors returned to cities where their homes were occupied, their families had vanished, and pre-war Jewish life remained only in fragments. Sometimes the cemetery was the last surviving place that still proved that Jews had lived there. They had not merely passed through. They had not appeared by accident. They had lived there for generations. This was the case in Kovel. Before the war, it was an important center of Jewish life, with educational institutions, libraries, a hospital, and religious and cultural organizations. In August 1942, approximately 5,000 Jews were murdered at the new Jewish cemetery. The cemetery itself survived the war in a damaged condition, but in 1970 it was finally destroyed. A cultural center and a park were built on the site, while the gravestones were used in the construction of a road near a military base. Here, it is especially difficult to draw a line between the different layers of the crime. The Nazi occupation brought mass murder. Post-war Soviet development destroyed the physical appearance of the site. One does not cancel out the other, and they should not be merged into a convenient formula. But the final result for memory was devastating. The people were murdered, and then the language of stone that could have told the world who they were disappeared as well. A stone can be moved, but the question remains in place. What disappears when a city builds a park where a murdered community lies buried? Can such a space be considered empty simply because graves are no longer marked on a map? And who is given the right to decide that memory has become too old for the modern city? The fourth layer is Soviet land. After the revolution, religious organizations were placed under strict administrative control. The law on religious associations, adopted in 1929, required registration and explicitly stated that religious societies did not possess the rights of legal entities. Even objects used in religious rituals were considered nationalized property that was merely provided to believers for their use. It is important to understand this without oversimplification. Soviet anti-religious policy was not directed solely against Jews. Churches, mosques, monasteries, religious schools, and cemeteries belonging to different faiths were closed. Cities expanded, and the authorities built roads, factories, stadiums, and residential districts. Some decisions were justified by sanitary regulations, others by the poor condition of the site, and others by the demands of urban development. But Jewish cemeteries were left particularly defenseless. After the Holocaust, many of them had almost no community remaining that could protect the land. Relatives had been murdered, evacuated, resettled, or had later emigrated. Religious life was kept under government control. Jewish national memory was increasingly viewed as a suspicious form of separateness that did not fit comfortably into the official narrative of a united Soviet people. As a result, what was formerly presented as an administrative or economic decision could have a far deeper consequence. The last visible trace of a specific Jewish history disappeared. We have reached the middle of this story. Write in the comments whether there is a place in your city whose past almost no one discusses, and support the video with a like or a subscription. It helps bring names and places that remained voiceless for far too long back into the conversation. Not every act of destruction was based on a specific order to erase the Jews. History is more complicated than that. State atheism, bureaucratic indifference, urbanization, shortages of city land, anti-Semitism, and the habit of treating the past as an obstacle to the future all came together. But the complexity of the causes does not make the consequences any less serious. For the authorities, it was a plot of land. For a family, it was the final point on the map of memory. In Kharkiv, the old Jewish cemetery, founded in 1799, began to be partially destroyed in the late 1930s. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the destruction was completed, and a park of culture and recreation was created on the grounds. Today, researchers describe it as a completely demolished and developed cemetery, where not a single gravestone has survived. A park appears to be the complete opposite of a cemetery. Children play there, music can be heard, and people sit on benches. But changing the function of the land does not erase what remains beneath the ground. It only makes the past invisible to the next generation. The fifth layer is the bulldozer. A bulldozer does not read inscriptions. It does not distinguish the name of a doctor from the name of a child. It does not know how many years a family came to visit that stone. The machine carries out a decision made somewhere in an office. That is precisely why it became such a powerful symbol of this history. One of the best-known examples is Vilnius, a city that before the Holocaust had been one of the most important centers of Jewish scholarship and culture. The cemetery in the Užupis district contained more than 70,000 burials. Burials ended in 1948, and beginning in 1964, the Soviet municipal authorities started removing the gravestones. Many of the slabs were used as construction material and turned into steps. A road was laid through the grounds, and a building for the funeral ceremonies of another religious denomination was constructed on part of the land. A small number of remains were relocated, but the majority of the burials remained in place. Imagine this detail. A person walks up a staircase without knowing that they are stepping on letters. Somewhere beneath the sole of a shoe lies half of a name. Somewhere else, a date of death. Somewhere else, words of blessing. When a gravestone is transformed into construction material, history does not disappear. It is humiliated. In Brest, the Jewish cemetery that had survived the Nazi occupation was dismantled in 1959, and the land was transformed into a sports area. Matzevot were later discovered in the foundations of houses, in road surfaces, pavements, and gardens. During one construction project, hundreds of stones were found. It was no longer possible to determine which grave each stone had originally belonged to. And here an uncomfortable truth must be acknowledged. It was not only the machinery of the state that participated in the destruction. Sometimes local residents carried the stones away. Sometimes builders saw high-quality material and did not want to ask questions. Sometimes people understood that the object before them was a gravestone, but assumed that the dead no longer had anyone to defend them. And yet this story must not be turned into an accusation against entire peoples. There were those who were indifferent. There were those who participated in the destruction. But there were also people who hid stones, reported discoveries, photographed inscriptions, stopped construction work, searched for relatives, and later returned matzevot to cemeteries. The history of memory is always composed not only of those who erase, but also of those who refuse to forget. The next layer is silence. Why did families not organize mass protests? Sometimes because there was no one left to protest. Sometimes because relatives lived in another city and learned about the demolition too late. Sometimes because openly defending a Jewish religious site could attract unwanted attention. Sometimes because a person had spent their entire life learning not to stand out, changing the pronunciation of their surname, telling their children as little as possible, and avoiding keeping unnecessary documents at home. Assimilation was not always a free choice. At times, it was a way of making a family less visible to the system. In Vilnius, relatives were formally given the opportunity to relocate individual graves to a new cemetery. But most of the remains stayed where they had originally been buried. This reveals the limits of individual rescue. One person might attempt to move a single grave, But no individual could save tens of thousands of burials and an entire historical landscape alone. The bulldozer does not argue with the past. It simply pretends that the past never existed. But sometimes a single surviving letter is stronger than an entire government order. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the long work of restoration and remembrance began. It could not recreate the lost graves in their original form. A stone cannot be returned to its precise location when the map has been destroyed. A name cannot be read when the slab has been broken in half. But the land can be recognized as a cemetery. Fragments can be collected. A memorial sign can be erected. The site can be entered into an official register. What remains legible can still be read. In Vilnius, after the restoration of independence, structures built from matzevot began to be dismantled, and fragments of the stones were returned to the cemetery grounds. In Brest, discovered gravestones were collected for decades, and in July 2025, a memorial made from more than 1,200 rescued stones and fragments was opened on the site of the destroyed cemetery. Stones that had been scattered across the city were brought together again. Not on their original graves, that was no longer possible, but once again within a space of remembrance. This does not correct the past. A memorial does not undo the stadium, the road, or the destroyed epitaph, but it restores dignity. It says, "These stones were not rubbish. These people were not ownerless. This place was not empty." And now, imagine the morning once again. Grass. A leaning matzeva. Several letters that survived war, the state, construction, and decades of silence. Someone steps closer and tries to read the name. At that moment, the cemetery becomes a book once more. What should be remembered from this story? A matzeva preserves not only a date of death, but also a family connection. Soviet policy deprived religious communities of an independent voice and made them dependent on decisions made by local authorities. In Kharkiv, a cemetery was transformed into a park. In Kovel, into a park and a cultural center. In Vilnius, gravestones became staircases, and in Brest, the stones were discovered for decades in roads and foundations. And there is one more thing. The destruction was not identical everywhere and cannot be explained by a single cause, but the result was often the same. Jewish memory was made invisible. A cemetery can be demolished. A stone can be carried away. Letters can be shattered. But as long as someone asks who was buried here, memory has not yet been defeated. If you watched until the end, write the code word matzeva in the comments. Like the video, subscribe, and share it. Sometimes the restoration of memory begins with the simplest action, speaking a name once again.